from the various perspective and thematic areas of migration, governance, and diaspora engagement. So really glad that today we continue this journey. We take a bit of a turn as we have covered the 23 objectives. And our intention for us today is to try and look at another compact as well as we talk about the Global Compact for Migration, which is the Global Compact on Refugees. Just to kick off, thanking all the organizers, so the organizations that are behind this webinar series. That's the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, the International Institute for Migration and Development, Metropolis Asia Pacific, Migrant Forum in Asia. Thank you to the organizations that have provided resources sitting in the background and making this course possible. And as for today, I am Paddy Sianga-Knudsen, one of the vice presidents from GRFDT, and I will be your moderator for the session. So today's session, we will be looking at the Global Compact for Migration, and also looking at its, one of the other sister compacts, as one would call it, which is the Global Compact on Refugees. Now, as we have managed to dive and covered quite a range of issues under the GCM, both in the classroom space, but also on the webinar series, we do know that, taking a bit of a step back, it was 2016 when the big topic for the first time at the United Nations General Assembly was on migration and refugee matters. And it was quite a key point in global relations, because here you had the heads of states, you had the governments coming together for the very first time at that global level to talk about migration and refugees. And by the end of that General Assembly, the 193 UN member states decided to adopt the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And it then led to these two, paving way for the Global Compact for Migration, as well as the Global Compact on Refugees. So quite a monumental time. And fast forward in 2018, the negotiations for the GCM came to an end, and we actually do have also a Global Compact for Migration, which has been the subject of this webinar series. And therefore, we can see that the Global Compact is indeed framed in a way that is sort of consistent. It's very much linked to the targets of the 2030 agenda, particularly looking at target 10.7. And it also is very clear in terms of trying to gather international cooperation to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration. We know that it tries to support this international cooperation on governance with regard to international migration, really not looking at migration from a national perspective, but understanding that it actually has international dimensions. And as a way of also providing kind of what they call a menu of options for states from which they can select some various policy options to address some of the pressing issues. And from the Global Compact for Refugees, I mean, much can also be said about that compact. We'll actually be sharing a link in it because it has not been a specific focus of the webinar series. But in today's investigation or in today's deliberation and discussion, we do know that there are some parallel lines that these two compacts often touch. We understand the issue of political willism is there. There's a principle of burden and responsibility sharing that is emphasized, as well as mobilization of the international community. There's also a call that is made in the Global Compact on Refugees for international community as a whole, including states and other stakeholders, to implement the compact itself through concrete actions, pledges, and contributions, as well as it was really looking at that first Global Refugee Forum, really putting refugee governance at the global scene. So there is much that can be said about it, and I'm glad that today we're joined by a very able panel that is going to take us through and present and share with us their reflections of their interaction with these global compacts, but particularly talking about some of the very thematic issues that they see coming out. In short, we're trying to ask ourselves, has it made a difference that we have had global compacts, looking back from a very thematic point of view and looking back to some of the migration governance challenges that are there. For the panel today, we have Professor Irudaya Rajan, who is the founder chairman of the International Institute of Migration and Development. We also have Boubacar Singate, who is the migration lead at the Red Cross based in the Gambia. We have Chiara Schisa. You correct me, Chiara, if I got your last name correctly, who is a PhD candidate in law at the School of Advanced Studies in Santa Ana in Italy. So we have a panel that handles many different issues in their daily walk of life, and really glad that they could be here to join us. We will kick off with Professor Rajan, and Professor Rajan, as I said, is the founder chairman of the International Institute of Migration and Development, which is actually one of the organizations that is behind this webinar series. And he's a former professor at the Center for Development Studies in Kerala in India, and he's been there for for over 40 years of postgraduate experience. He's also the chair of the Global Knowledge Platform on Migration and Development, which is a World Bank working group on internal migration and urbanization. He's one of the expert committee members to advise the government of Kerala on COVID-19. He's published several international journals on various topics, from the social aspect, economic, demographic, and as well as the political implications of migration, looking at individuals, community, economy, and society. And he's the editor of the annual series India Migration Report since 2010, as well as the South Asia Migration Report since 2017. He's the founder editor-in-chief for Migration and Development, which is a journal under Taylor and Francis. Professor Rajan, a wealth of experience there, I think both of internal migration as well as international migration, the various spaces that you have engaged with. We wanted to get a sense with you, really looking at data issues, and maybe also sharing with us some of your reflections from the returning migrants' perspective. Over to you, Professor Rajan.
Thank you, Paddy, for the introduction. And I would like to spend probably the first leg of my presentation, or first leg of my intervention, because we are now running 4th year of the Global Compact on Migration. It's under review now. But I had a meeting with the Government of India some time back. I also had a meeting with IOM regarding the work on what we have done on CGM. And I would like to pick up a point of a database. I think this is very, very important. And if you look at the Global Compact on Migration, which was almost 4 years back now, for migrants and migration, we had 2 bad years, 2020 and 21, because of the COVID-19. We are completely, everything was closed. And one of the groups which are affected by COVID-19 is migrants and migration. But when you look at the Global Compact on Migration, if you look at the first objective itself, I would like to quote the Global Compact on Migration. It says that we recognize that there is a continuous need for international efforts to strengthen our knowledge and analyze migration, as shared understanding will improve policies that unlock the potential of sustainable development. And I would like to emphasize the next sentence, which is the page 4 of the document. We must collect and disseminate quality of data. We must collect and disseminate quality of data. But I would like to spend some time on this particular thing. We must collect. Now, what did we know about migrants? How much the countries invest on collecting data on migration, migrants, refugees, internal migrants, how much they invest on that? I think this is what I would like to spend some time. And I would like to quote based on the examples what we have right now, and give you some more examples. We have failed to do anything to understand the new database. And it's not only the data, we also talk about quality of data, disaggregated by sex, region, caste groups. We can talk about, there is no disaggregation. I want to quote an example. Now we know that there is a crisis happening between Russia and Ukraine. There is a war going on. And if you look at it, take the case of India, how India failed, or how India failed to collect data or invest on data. in the Ministry of External Affairs, which handles migration data, in its website, they have put the data, Indians in Ukraine. They have put a data, which is available in the internet to download. Indians in 180 countries. And the number says, non-resident Indians is 7,541 and PIO is 422. Total Indians in Ukraine was 7,963. This was the number put by the government of India in its Ministry of External Affairs website. Prior to the war, a crisis. We have COVID crisis, now we have a different crisis. Man-made crisis or some other crisis, but there is a crisis now. People are moving, lot of displacement, lot of refugees. Now, look at that. The Indian government said only 7,963 people belong to India or Indian origin in Ukraine. But on 15th March 2022, just 15 days back, the External Affairs Minister said in Indian Parliament, not talk anywhere, Indian Parliament, the statement is available in the External Affairs website, which says that we have ensured 22,500 Indian citizens returned safely through the Operation Ganga. 22,500 Indians were brought by the government of India. And it says, some of the Indians said they are not coming. That means they have not brought back all Indians. 22,500. If you look at the number, India underestimated the number by 200%. They said 7,000, but they brought people 22,500. Where are they? This is what we talk about migration and migrants. We are all interested in remittances, but I'm very sad to say this has happened to Indian government. So I told the Indian government saying that you are underestimated by 200% for one country. Now the actual number came to limelight when there was a crisis. We cannot go for war, every country to get actual number of Indians. I'm sorry. This is not the way to get the Indians in other countries. So this is the reality. And not only that, when he put the statement, he said, Indians from 35 states and territories are in the Ukraine. That means every state and every place in India, there are some people in Ukraine. And he said that at least more than 1,000 students from Kerala, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Bihar, and Rajasthan. That means we got some disaggregated data that there are some states they are sending student migration. And the states which they were talking about, like Uttar Pradesh, was not even in the picture. We never talk about Uttar Pradesh international migration students. They talk about Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh. So this is the situation of country like India, which receives $87 billion remittances. That means we are not investing to collect data on migration. Now, similarly, I'll give one more point, and I will hand over to for the Paddy to ask other people. We have global crisis. According to the Indian government, there are 18 million Indians are anywhere in the world. This is also reported by the World Migration Report 2022. Last year, 15 March 2021, not 22, we had listened to the minister about war crisis. In 15 March 2021, the minister reported, we brought 4.5 million return migrants through the Vande Bharat flights. From 147 countries. Now, please remember, Indians are present in 180 plus countries, 18 million. Out of that, 4.5 million came back. That means 1/4 of the migrants, Indian migrants, have come back to India. What I call them distress return. Distress return. In the case of Kerala, where I live right now in India, Kerala has the highest number of migrants as per the Kerala Migration Survey. I run large-scale migration surveys in Kerala for last 20 years. We did in Kerala, we did in Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Gujarat, Goa. And we are planning to do in Jharkhand, Telangana, and Tamil Nadu second round in 2022. But Kerala, we got 2.1 million Keralites are in the Gulf countries. The finance minister of Kerala said 14 lakhs have come back, or 1.4 million. That means 2/3 of the people have come back to India. And people who are participating in the conference here from different countries, I know there are people from different countries. You look at your country. I'm giving the example from India because I'm more familiar there. You can look at your own country and check yourself how much your country invested, because the global compact on migration clearly says you have to invest on producing quality data to have what is called the informed policies, evidence-based policies. That means you don't have evidence. How do you talk about migration policies? So we have no evidence right now. We are only talking some numbers. And then returned migrants came back. I did a study recently. At least half of the returned migrants who came to Kerala alone said they have not received their salaries during COVID-19. 3 months, 4 months, some people were forced to come, their jobs were terminated. Somebody was working for 20 years in the Gulf country, they were not given them the terminal permits. India lost crores of money through what I call daylight robbery. Daylight robbery by the employers in the Gulf countries. And this is also true, because many of the returned migrants, I spoke to them, they said, this is a distress return. We have returned, but we want to remigrate. Return to remigrate. We always talk about returned migrant rehabilitation, returned migrant development, returned migrant integration, but the migrant is talking about return to remigrate. What are the policies in place in countries of origin to tackle this return migration issue? What are the mechanisms for them to collect their unpaid salaries from the countries of destinations and rich countries? Rich countries taking away the money of the poor countries. It can be in Africa, it can be Nigeria, it can be Kenya, it can be Ghana, it can be Nepal. What are the mechanisms we have to get their money, what they rightfully earn in the countries of destination? And many countries use COVID as an opportunity to get rid of the excess migrants and adjusted their migration policy, what is called the nationalization of their migration policy. They want to employ more people, their own nationals, and they have used COVID as an opportunity. I'm going to stop here. I would like to get back with more comments in the next level. Thank you very much, Paddy.
Professor Rajan, thank you very much for for highlighting to us some of the very critical issues that are related to data, and also bringing to mind where do we see instruments coming to play a role with persistent or new crisis. I think those two highlights on the COVID-19 and also what is coming out of the Ukraine crisis in terms of migrants moving is a real demonstration of the important work that still remains to be done in these areas. And we're just wondering, when we come back to you later, you know, having these sort of persistent issues and knowing that we're going towards the IMRF, at least for the Global Compact for Migration, and knowing that, you know, even within the Global Compact for Refugees, there is a space in which governments engage at the national level. What would you sort of give out as some of the recommendations in which we should be looking to tighten some of the measures that we haven't taken care of? So in short, if we look back at 2018 and the framework in itself on data, which is GCM1, but like you have said, cuts across many areas. You've talked about return, you've talked about remittances, and one could also open those to other spaces in terms of fair recruitment, which is, you know, the conditions also for re-return, and talking also about ethical work and decent work environments, social security benefits, and many others. You know, what could the GCM then as an instrument look like, so that it serves the purpose in which we are in today, where we've learned from COVID, we're learning from new crisis, but we're also learning indeed from other crises that are continue to be going on in many parts of the world. But thank you very much for sharing those reflections. We will move on to the next panelist, and I will ask Boubacar, just as Boubacar is getting ready to join us. Boubacar is a humanitarian who volunteered for the Gambia Red Cross Society, that's kicking off his career there, and he has a major in development studies from the University of the Gambia, as well as holding a certificate of advanced study in pedagogical approaches to education, humanitarian principles and values from the University of Teacher Education in Switzerland. He also holds a diploma in youth development work, as well as in ICT. He has been he has been working with the Red Cross as a youth, and he also served in different youth leadership positions, including the National Youth Commission of the Gambia Red Cross, where he provided a lot of different support and guidance on some of the youth activities there. And he has also worked around issues of disaster preparedness and response, with a focus on things like climate change, migration, community health, and also looking at youth and community development. He's currently working as the European Union Trust Fund on Migration, which is a project that is financed by the EU. And within the Red Cross, he is the migration project coordinator for this particular project, as well as the national migration focal point for the Gambia Red Cross Society. He has served as a coach for migrant returnees, and serves also on a number of other boards within the Gambia and in many other spaces. Boubacar, just as we ask you to come on, I read that bio very carefully because I think it's very important for us to hear from the humanitarian space, and the engagement there that you see quite explicit with the Global Compact on Refugees, and also talking about some of the protection services, whether it's looking at basic services for migrants along all the stages of the migratory journey, as well as awareness raising towards enhancing the protection of migrants. Boubacar, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from my current location in Senegal, Sali. Thank you, Paddy. Thank you to my co-panelists, and then to the beautiful audience out there. My name is Boubacar, of course, as introduced by Paddy. So I work with the Gambia Red Cross as the national migration focal point, but also looking at the issue of humanitarian education. But also overseeing this EUTF migration project that the Gambia Red Cross is implementing in collaboration with the Spanish Red Cross. So generally, talking from a humanitarian perspective, the Red Crescent movement, which the Gambia Red Cross Society is part of, it sort of has a broader definition, a broader and a deliberate definition of who is a migrant. And for us, this includes migrants in transit, returnees, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, you name it, just to ensure that we are able to cover the needs of these migrants. Because the reason why this broader definition is given is because the Red Crescent movement, approaches migration from a neutral lens, and as well more from a humanitarian perspective, addressing the vulnerabilities of migrants. So if we are addressing the vulnerabilities of migrants, let's say, who again are we considering as a migrant? That was the definition that I gave. Because if you say, okay, refugees, now the Red Cross is only responding to the issue of refugees. No, but instead we are responding to even those that are internally displaced or those that are displaced across borders. So it's also important that we know that the Red Cross has quite a unique role in terms of providing basic essential services or access to basic essential services for migrants, especially those that are in distress, purely focusing on their vulnerabilities, because this is what the Red Crescent movement does. We respond to the vulnerabilities of individuals based solely on their needs. So wherever you are, and this is also important to note that all what we're doing as Red Crescent movement or the Gambia Red Cross is anchored or confined within the fundamental principles of the Red Cross. Of course, we have the principle of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, voluntary service, independence, so on. So whatever we do, we try to ensure that each and every action of the Red Cross does not conflict with the principles. So for instance, if we have to look at the principle of neutrality, of course, we understand that at some point, other organizations might not be able to intervene in certain aspects in responding to the needs of migrants. But of course, the Red Crescent movement has an obligation to ensure that we're able to respond to the needs of migrants. So in essence, going into details as to what we're doing in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to migrants, is that the Red Cross uses a unique approach, which is called the humanitarian service points in most cases. This is, happening in the South Americas, in all parts of the world, I would say. The Red Cross, even in the Gambia here, we have humanitarian service points. This is considered as a neutral and safe space where migrants can access essential services and including information regarding their migration rights, to ensure that they are protected, but also they are able to receive assistance whenever they need it. So these services or humanitarian service points are as well positioned along migratory routes, just to ensure wherever migrants are, we're able to provide them with access to basic services. For instance, let's take an example. If we have a undocumented migrant, obviously the notion is, or the belief is, this person would tend to run away from the authorities, or maybe run away from getting in contact with the authorities. When this happens, if the person is sick, how would this person go to the hospital and sought for medical assistance? It is definitely going to be a problem for this person. And then in ensuring that we are able to uphold the dignity of this particular individual, then there is a need for the Red Cross to be able to provide the necessary humanitarian assistance to this individual. So this is why with the Red Cross, what we do basically revolves around the needs of the individuals. We respond where there exist needs. Now, if a migrant should, for instance, be traveling along the route and needs food, runs out of pocket to buy food, needs shelter, doesn't have anywhere to sleep, these are the kind of things that the Red Cross would provide you, just to ensure while you are transiting or while you're migrating, then you are able to have access to essential services, which is, of course, very importantly, a fundamental human right that should be upheld. Of course, we know states have the obligation to ensure that they protect the rights of every individual found within the borders of their country, but the states cannot do everything all by themselves. This is where the humanitarian actors need to come in. Actors like the Red Cross comes in and then fulfill those obligations to ensure that migrants, regardless of their status, regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity, religious, or are able to receive these essential services in order to uphold their dignity. So in essence, the services that we are providing along this migratory route through our humanitarian service points, through our volunteers in the field, volunteers and staffs in the field, includes access to healthcare services, access to food, access to non-food items, which of course includes clothing, hygiene kits, hygiene and dignity kits that are also culturally appropriate or sensitive to the individual. You know, of course, this is also the hygiene and dignity kit is also looked at from the perspective of what a female need might not be the same need as to a man. So, of course, we have to distinguish the needs of women from men so that they are able to access these services while they are moving, including children. Doesn't matter, because you might be traveling with a child and then run out of diapers, run out of some, you know, essential hygiene kits for the child. And then, you know, the Red Cross, these are some of the things that we can give you to be able to ensure that the dignity of every individual, even as young as a baby, is being upheld while the person travels. So psychosocial support and counseling are also part of the services that we provide. You know, of course, we make best use of services of social workers from the government. And then, you know, family reunification, which is also very important, especially if we talked about the Objective 8 of the GCM, which talks about missing migrants. You know, this is also something that the Red Cross, you know, clearly works around to ensure that families are able to, you know, have news of their loved ones, or know the whereabouts of their loved ones. This has happened even to me. My cousin, up till date, we didn't know whether he's alive or he's dead, which is of course sad to the entire family. But of course, some of those services needs to be there for people to be able to have at least, you know, closure, to know that yes, my relative is alive, he's sound and well, or he's dead. Then we need to close up and all that. Aside from that as well, we also provide sort of legal assistance. In short, we don't have the expertise to provide legal assistance, but what we do is refer you to the services. For instance, in the Gambia, we have this National Agency for Legal Aid, we have the IOM office, we have the national embassies. Also, we have other migrant organizations or associations where migrants are referred to access legal assistance. And I think this is also quite good, regardless of your background, regardless of your status as a migrant, you're able to receive such services from us. So in essence, our work revolves around providing humanitarian assistance and protection services for migrants. Migrants, in short, includes all categories of migrants: refugees, returnees, migrants in transit, asylum seekers, stateless persons, internally displaced persons, people displaced across borders. So this is the broader definition that the Red Cross has. So I'll stop here and then, you know, maybe I'll continue on as we move. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Boubacar, for bringing us into understanding the work of the Red Cross and also unpacking sort of, you know, when we hear about humanitarian assistance and needs and how those are served. But I think in terms also of talking about the definitions or the parameters, and I think that remains essentially important. Some critical questions obviously coming your way, as you will see that in a lot of times when you've got the Red Cross coming in, they are engaged, like you have said, in providing humanitarian assistance. But you know, so for instance, one of the questions that comes to mind is about partnerships, because there's a lot of services that you would like to provide. So for instance, I take an example of family reunification, in which all the legal advice, as you have said, or immigration's advice for So do you want to just talk to us about how, for instance, you see, let's say, the Global Compact on Refugees or the Global Compact on Migration helping some of the work that you do as the Red Cross in providing some of these services, maybe with examples from a family reunification point of view, where the Red Cross doesn't give these documents, and the legalization of this particular process is done obviously with governments. So maybe just from that perspective, as an example, you know, do you see any impact that comes from GCM or GCR in the intervention of the work of the Red Cross?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, knowing fully that the GCM, GCR, these are intergovernmentally, negotiated documents, or let's say agreements. Of course, it gives the Red Cross quite a unique role in terms of what should be done in order to be able to, provide such humanitarian assistance to people in need. For instance, if we have to talk about the issue of our family reunification, of course, the ICRC, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, has a unique status to issue travel documents to people who might want to reconnect with their families. For instance, you might have someone from the Gambia what embarked on a migratory journey, but along the line, the person lost contact with the family, and then now the family tried to trace this individual, and then fortunately they were able to get back into contact. And these individuals now wants to, this individual, sorry, wants to go back to his family, and but doesn't have the means to do that. The ICRC, in a special status, can accord this individual issue travel documents to this individual to be able to reunite with the family. So that is one specific example. But also, let me come to say that in the Gambia, we are working with the government of the Gambia to ensure that migrants, regardless of their status, are able to access essential services. This, for instance, takes into account the agreements that the Gambia Red Cross have signed with the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Welfare in terms of provision of social welfare services to migrants, with the Gambia Immigration Department to ensuring that, migrants, regardless of their status, are able to receive humanitarian assistance and protection from the Red Cross. And I am quite happy to say that, these relationships with the government are working quite well in the Gambia. And then, importantly as well, in terms of access to healthcare, we've signed agreement with the Ministry of Health as well, different health facilities, to ensure that migrants, whenever they are sick, they're able to receive access to healthcare, not only with the government, but even with the private sector, because we have pharmacies we have signed agreement with. And then, usually when the health facility, when they are sick and then visit the health facility, medications are prescribed sometimes, and then these pharmacies then would issue medications to these migrants just to ensure that their human rights are protected, their dignities are upheld. So I mean, in a sense, these are practical examples of what we are doing in the Gambia, and I think they're proven quite worthwhile in the context of the GCM GCR. Thank you.
Boubacar, thank you. Boubacar, thank you very much for sharing on those two reflections, and also to note that Boubacar is one of the students. So that's very good, for us, as we have always said in GCM, everyone is a body of knowledge, and it has been very good to just listen to your initial reflections on this panel, and I'm sure we will be hearing more from you. In fact, I think as you are coming back, one of the challenging questions I think that always comes to international players and organizations such as the Red Cross, and maybe we give this for you as food for thought, is that yes, indeed, you have this partnership with private sector, you have the partnership with government, and then the services obviously that go to communities and individuals, as you have elaborated, and then sometimes what remains is the visibility, right? So the visibility of the Red Cross. So for instance, in the Ukraine-Russia crisis, in my personal involvement, looking at students being evacuated, everybody expected the Red Cross to come and evacuate them. So this is, you go on the Twitter spaces, you go into speaking to students, they keep saying, where is the Red Cross? Why isn't the Red Cross taking us out from this space? So you see sort of that visibility that the Red Cross has. And then at the same time, we're also seeing news, for instance, alleged news that came out from the same crisis, where the Red Cross storage in Ukraine was targeted through the conflict. So you sort of see how there's a lot of attention then to the services that they provide. So it's a bit of a tricky question. So something for you to just think about as you come back to us in your concluding remarks, the visibility of the Red Cross, both for individuals, but also the danger that comes in providing humanitarian service. And then what can these global compacts then do for the safety of humanitarian actors in the difficult spaces that the Red Cross works among other humanitarian actors. So that's a challenging question that we bring back to you in your space. And then but thanks again, Boubacar, for sharing those reflections. And we move on our panel and introduce our next speaker, Chiara Schiscia. I think you will pronounce it better than I will, Chiara. I'll be learning some Italian today, who is a PhD student in law at the Institute of Law, Politics and Development at Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Italy. She's also the coordinator of the Environmental Migration Hub within the Institute's DREAM research area. And she's also a former visiting research fellow at the IOM's regional office in Vienna, which was particularly looking in the section that looks at migration, environment, and climate change. She has served as an external peer reviewer for the upcoming UNESCO's SIDS Resilience Report. And previously, she served as the Human Rights and Migrant Protection Focal Point at the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, and collaborated also with a number of universities in the space of migration, asylum, sustainable development, human rights, among others. And this is particularly in the space that she does work with the University of Bologna, where she has worked as a supervisor, a tutor, and a project assistant. She has a master's degree in international cooperation and the protection of human rights from the same university. Chiara, we are really glad to have you here. Apart from you teaching me how to say your last name, I think it would be very interesting, maybe just in your first initial reactions, to combine two questions. One, where we're trying to sort of find out that when we look at the global compacts, you know, the provisions that they have on environment and migration, you know, where does that come from? And at the same time, would also like to get a sense of, you know, what do these global compacts then have to say about environmental migration? So maybe if you can give us some responses to these before we move on to some questions, to some other questions. Chiara.
Thank you, Paji. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. My name is Chiara Schiscia, but don't worry, it's a very difficult surname even for Italian speakers. So really, don't worry at all. If we have further opportunities to collaborate, I'm sure you will learn to spell my surname perfectly. So yeah, I really would like to speak about environmental migration. I saw that you held an event on climate change and migration some times ago, so I'm not gonna dive into the topics because the audience, I believe, it's already an expert in this field. But just to say that if you think about it, environmental migration puts together two major challenges of our times, because you have climate change on the one hand and forced migration, and the adverse drivers of forced migration on the other hand. So when you put two global phenomena together and you would like to address two global phenomena such as climate change and migration, you must make sure to deliver adequate and comprehensive policy responses. Also, another important thing to say is that we don't have a definition nor a protection framework for environmental migrants. We have some working definitions. For instance, the IOM has launched a working definition of environmental migration, which is really broad because it focuses on people compelled to flee or who decided to do so because of climate change, because of environmental degradation, and who move within their country or across borders, as well as on a temporary or permanent basis. So this definition can capture the multi-causality of this global phenomenon again. And given the total lack of a protection framework of measures to address environmental migration, the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants plays a pivotal role in recognizing that dire environmental and climate conditions can trigger both voluntary and forced migration movements, and that can, of course, affect human mobility. We know that there are some commonly recognized forms of human mobility, such as migration, displacement, and planned relocations. And we know also that the two global compacts stem from the Declaration of Refugees and Migrants, and indeed they provide a holistic approach to the climate change migration nexus. Indeed, we have many objectives of the Global Compact which expressly recognize the environmental adverse drivers of migration. For instance, Objective 2 on the need to minimize the adverse drivers of forced migration, but also Objective 5 on the need to create regular migration pathways, as well as Objective 7 on the need to alleviate and reduce vulnerabilities. So the Global Compact for Migration, but also the Global Compact on Refugees really dive into the topic of environmental migration, both with general measures as well as with specific measures. Because, for instance, in the Global Compact for Migration, we see that states commit to strengthen their knowledge on migration dynamics related to climate change through mapping, through data gathering. Professor Rajan was talking about data set, and this is absolutely relevant in the case of environmental migration, where, you know, as it is a multi-causal phenomenon, it's very difficult to foresee and to understand the dimensions of these kind of movements. But also we have specific measures and specific actions that states can undertake. For instance, they could invest in programs in order to strengthen their development programs, as well as their early warning and disaster reduction mechanisms. It is absolutely relevant, and the GCM notes this, to include displacement considerations into climate change provisions, as well as climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. And also, of course, when we talk about regular migration pathways, the GCM underlines the need to provide education pathways, work, legal labor pathways from countries vulnerable to climate change, and of course to people affected by climate change, as well as also through humanitarian admissions. So we have three avenues to let environmental migrants access the territory of another state, namely education, work, and protection. Finally, the last thing I would like to say is that the focus of environmental migration is prominent in the Global Compact on Migration, but is also present in the Global Compact on Refugees, where it recognizes that dire environmental conditions can trigger forced migration movements, which do not amount to persecution and therefore are excluded from the application of the 1951 Refugee Convention, but still are very much relevant when it comes to protection mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for enlightening us and also just taking us to the very specific references, both in the GCM as well as in the GCR on the space of climate migration. Actually, yesterday, another People's Migration Challenge, in which all these organizations that are here as organizers as well, we are organizing a lot of conversations or rather discussions towards the IMRF, and we had this particular topic yesterday as well, where we're talking about, you know, migration, as you said, on one side, looking at labor migration, but then climate change on the other space. So one of the other questions, maybe, you know, thinking about this mode that we have been in, is talking about some of the best practices, you know. So Are there any best practices that you see that are linked to Global Compact provisions on environmental migration? And do you see any gaps and weaknesses in this respect as well?
Yes, thank you very much, Paddy. Yeah, actually, there are some interesting best practices in the world. For instance, I'm from Italy, and I can bring the example of Italy. This is also very interesting and curious because Italy, as you might know, has not signed the GCM, but still it has, maybe not, they didn't know about it, but they actually implemented the GCM because actually the Italian migration law is one of the most advanced in the world concerning environmental migration. For instance, in the context of the European Union, Italy is the only EU country providing multiple protection statuses to people fleeing because of climate change. Especially in 2018, namely when the GCM and the GCR have been adopted, the Italian government included into our immigration law a specific residence permit against calamities, environmental calamities, climate calamities, and this measure not only provides protection, but also access to the labor market. So in Italy now we have a measure through which, we have one measure through which the two objectives of the GCM are implemented, namely Objective 2, reducing the adverse drivers of migration, of forced migration, and regular pathway, even if Italy, again, has not signed the GCM. And another very interesting best practice comes from Africa, namely in the IGAD region, which is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. The IGAD member states have adopted very recently a protocol on the free movement of people, which also includes specific provisions related to environmental migration. For instance, not only in the aftermath of a disaster, but also in the anticipation of a disaster, people coming from the IGAD member states may find protection in other IGAD member states, and also they are protected against removal into their country of origin, of course, when there are dire environmental and climate conditions. So there are some best practices in this sense. Of course, everything can be ameliorated, everything can become, even better. For instance, one flaw that I see in the GCM and in the GCR is that they both apply only in the context of cross-border movements. So internally displaced are excluded from their provisions. And as we know, climate change will probably trigger most internal displacement. Just think about the ground zero report of the World Bank in this sense. And another thing that, in my opinion, is missing is states' awareness of this link between climate change and migration. For instance, in the European Union, but also in the Americas, there are many normative advancements in the field of climate change and in the field of migration, but they are treated separately. They don't interact with each other. And of course, when it comes to environmental migration, as I said at the beginning, you need to have both focuses. Otherwise, you are missing 50% of the topic. So I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I think it's been very refreshing. Just on those reflections. Again, like you have said, we are not, we are not short of best practices, and that means that for sure there's a lot that the world can pick up, and there's a lot that countries could also pick up for those who haven't expanded. I think the conceptual view of the different issues that have to do with environmental migration or migration as a consequence of climate change. But then also, I think at the same time, bringing your discussion to where you ended, talking about the disconnect at the very national level where everything happens. And I would even take it to one more level, which is the sub-national level, actually, because people live in communities, people live in the municipality is usually then in charge. And to think that even in that particular structure, the discussion around climate migration is taking place maybe predominantly with immigration without involvement of climate colleagues. One other thing that we have learned and that keeps on popping up in this discussion is also kind of looking at the issue of not just the disconnect that you have between the two separate issues, but also understanding that you've got to unpack adaptation, but also, like you have said, the anticipation that people may also migrate because of the anticipation, and then marry it very closely to what's happening in the labor migration space, which is visa. So just the unpacking still remains very important. So we need more climate experts in the migration space, talking to us very concretely about what the consequences are and what the action of people are. And then for those who understand what labor migration is, opening up the space to understand what those spaces are. So that's been very interesting to hear from you. Maybe as something that will give you for your reflection, that will be after we get into the Q&A in a moment. When you look at the Global Compact on refugees, you look at the Global Compact for migration, and you think about Italy, for instance, a country that didn't even sign up to a GCM. But you also think about countries that maybe needed a GCM or GCR for them to open up different spaces. Where do you see the spaces for them to improve? Because it would be great to get more recruits into the GCM as natural. And of course, for the GCR, it's sort of implied as well. We also know that the GCM is not binding. So one of the other questions that we wanted to pose to you is sort of, what do we do in this space? What about international conventions that countries have already signed up to? Can advocacy, so there may be the role of advocacy, work in that direction to raise attention to what governments have already signed to on dealing with climate migration? So maybe if you could come back and give us some reflections on that, that would be great. But this has been really interesting to hear from you. And again, just bringing back all our panelists so that our panelists can listen in to on the Q&A, because now we will open the floor for our panelists to hear from the students that we have with us in the room. Where actually it's when I say student, I think it doesn't give justice to who is in the room. So just kicking off the questions there, Ms. Grace, you're welcome to share.
Me? Paddy? Yeah, no question actually, but just to confirm Professor Rajan's issue on appropriate migration data. Just today, we had the last meeting for the IRR, implementing rules and regulations of the new Department of Migrant Workers in the Philippines. And of course, there was mention of appropriate data. And I think I'd like to connect it to climate migration too, because the Philippines is, I think, top 3 also in disaster management. So we've had the strongest typhoon, I think, in the world's history in 2013, Haiyan. And so I think there was maybe rural to urban migration and maybe even international migration. So I'd like to just say that, yes, hopefully I could be part of this new Department of Migration and really push to have the actual data for migrants and also for climate migration. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Ngozi?
Yeah, okay. Thank you to the panelists. Please, Ms. Kiara, now we have some states in the Micronesia and Polynesia are fast disappearing, and the inhabitants are seeking refuge in several places around the world. So, and we know that the Magna Carta of Protection is the 1951 UN Convention. So what could be done to capture environmental people displaced by environment as a refugee in the convention? Thank you. And to Abubakar, In my country, Nigeria, migration is not a political issue, unlike Gambia, where you are, where some presidential candidates had to struggle about migration, especially the return and readmission with the EU, the externalization policy. So, what is your NGO or your body doing to give awareness? Because if awareness is part of humanitarian aid, so what is your organization doing to create awareness about stigmatization? Because when people are deported, the society is part of the migration, is part of the actors, those who are not migrating, the non-migrants. So what is your organization doing to sensitize them about against stigmatizing deportees? Because those people that are deported are not criminals, or just that they don't have documents doesn't make them criminals. And because of that, there is a social theory that pushes these people that are deported, that feel that they are defeated. There is a social theory that pushes them back to remigration. And many of them end up becoming even hardened criminals because they know what is along the route and they become human traffickers. So what is your organization doing to sensitize the society about stigmatization? And the issue of data, we know that the EU always concentrates on return and readmission, but there is no enough data to show that these people they are returning, so many are still going back. And when they are going back, they are still recruiting people. So when you return them, they know the routes, they know how to evade the rules and the laws. So there is not enough data that is being captured about those that we are deported and remigrated, and it is not cost effective. Thank you.
I think some good questions there that also Professor Rajan can attend to. Can we take one more question and then we can ask our panelists to respond and then come back again into the group? One more question? Okay, maybe we have our panelists respond to this first round of questions and then we will go back again to the panel, to the Q&A. Professor Rajan, would you like to kick off?
Yes. Thank you. I think the data which I talk about, I think we need good quality data on migration. I think that I made it my point very clearly. I think why we need this data, I think this is something very, very important. Because we are talking about evidence-based policy. If you have no data, how do you make policies on that? I think that is something very important. Second thing, for example, when I think it is Saira or someone talking about local level, because Kerala is part of India, but India has not a good data, but Kerala has reasonably good data compared to India. We have migration corridor, we have gender profile data, we have the data on cost of migration, remittances from countries based on a big migration survey we are doing for last 20 years. We do every 5 years. Now, the importance is, it was useful even during crisis. It is not the normal period, because I was very keen, in the normal period, if you have no data, it is fine. But when you have an abnormal period like COVID or the war, if you had good data, it would have been much easier for us. Now take the example of COVID-19 crisis. When suddenly there was a lockdown in India announced by the Prime Minister of India, just one fine 8 o'clock in the night. Within 4 hours, everything was closed. Airports, train, everything was closed, completely closed. And he mentioned for 2 weeks. Then he extended for 2 more weeks. Then he extended for 2 more weeks. It was extended for close to 2.5 months. So people, we are migrants. And no state government went to the Prime Minister to tell them to bring back Indians, because no state government had any data on that. Only the Kerala government went to the Prime Minister and went to the Supreme Court. Not only Prime Minister was not listening, because no other people are talking about bringing back migrants. He is alone. Kerala Chief Minister is alone, giving some to bring back Indians. But then he is not listening, so he went to Supreme Court. Then Supreme Court asked the Kerala government, are you ready with beds for quarantine for the returned migrants? Are you ready? Then the Kerala government went to Supreme Court and told, we have 2.1 million migrants are in the Gulf and globally, and we expect at least 15% people will come back. As per the estimate, because I was advising the Kerala government during COVID-19. So the Kerala government went to the Supreme Court, said that we are ready with 300,000 beds. Based on that, Supreme Court suggested the Indian government to start bring back Indians. So after 1.5 months, there was a special flight went. Of course, it was benefited by the whole country. But then pushing for the return migration, because we had data, we were ready to organize 300,000 beds. I think that was a change in the whole policy at the time, because no state had no data. So I think it is very, very important for state government, local, even community levels. I think if you have a good data, it will be useful, not only in the normal times, even the abnormal times. I think that's very, very important. And along with that, because we had data on return migrants, because some of you probably listening to this one, never we had return migration data. Return migration is not in our type of research. But first time, every country in the world produced return migration data. Why? Because they were put quarantine. India said we brought 4.5 million people. Every day people are coming. You never put any data. First time the Indian government said we brought 4.5 million Indians from outside, return migrants. Never in the history of Indian migration, they never had any data. That is again forced data collection. Because they arrived there, they are sent into quarantine for 2 weeks. Some people went home, some people went to hotel, some people went to hostels. So I think this is not the way to collect data on migration. Very sad situation. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Professor Rajan. Again, on that, talking about the distressed returns and the fact that when they are not well planned, even the level of support that they would get from the local level becomes affected. So also the need for probably local registries, how do we go back to what used to be the basics? Like somebody said, we need the combination of both the high tech and the low tech to come back together with a lot of, in dealing with some of the challenges that we have, and data is essentially one of them. I think one of the other questions that had come into my chat was sort of talking about the quality of data when you were talking about the quality of data and the kind of value that it adds. But I think you've addressed that, the response to that question, which was sort of talking about, what difference does it make when data is disaggregated? And I think you just touched on it in terms of the level of preparedness, but you can again, I think, go back and re-emphasize, why do we emphasize on disaggregated data if we look on one side that the policies that are being made, maybe it's not the data they're looking for, but the political ambitions. Maybe to also just open it up a little bit, are policies on migration really being made because they're looking at the data, or is it a political ambition that is actually driving the migration policy? So this is a question that we can come back to you. Kiara, did you want to shed some light on those questions that were asked by Ngozi as well?
Yes, absolutely. Also, thank you, Ngozi, for your very interesting question. It's also very useful for me because in that case, I can bridge also with the questions asked by Paddy. So I will combine my answer to all the questions together. So yeah, absolutely, you are right. The 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention is the milestone of international refugee law. As the date might get you the idea of the historical context in which the convention has been adopted, namely after the Second World War. Climate change was not an issue back then. The thing is that as it stands, the 1951 Refugee Convention is very hardly applicable to cases of forced migration because of climate change or environmental threats. Because first of all, in order to be eligible for the refugee status under the Geneva Convention, you need to be outside your country of origin. And as we said, most people affected by climate change remain within their country of origin, are internally displaced. So this is already a strong normative obstacle. Second of all, the Refugee Convention requires an actor of persecution, a state, a non-actor state, an individual, but there is a need for an actor of harm, of persecution. How can you prove that climate change is an actor of persecution? Climate change is a phenomenon. It's not an actor. It does not intentionally harm people. Also, you need to prove that climate change intentionally persecutes you because of your race, because of your ethnicity, because of your religion, because of your political opinion, which is something, of course, very difficult to do. Here in the chat box, I can send you a very relevant link, in my opinion, which are the legal considerations of Unhcr on climate change. Because, of course, right now we have these huge normative obstacles, but still environmental considerations can support an asylum claim. So they can absolutely play a role in this. And to answer Paddy, what can we, or better said, what can the international community do to improve the application and implementation of the two global compacts? Well, this is something that the international community can do. We have the Refugee Convention, which is like 70 years old. Maybe it's time to amend the Refugee Convention in order to capture the current causes of forced migration, which differs from the one, the causes of migration back in the after the Second World War, namely. So this is something that, of course, states can do, namely amend existing international conventions. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Chiara, for sharing those reflections. And indeed, I think you managed to also set the stage, like I said, for some of the questions that we have already asked you before in the change that we want to see. And I guess, remaining that, how do migration governance frameworks or mechanisms like that remain relevant for the issues that are being faced by migrants? So thank you very much for sharing in those reflections. Boubacar, did you want to touch on some of the questions that were addressed to you from Ngozi? And you can combine with the question that we gave to you.
Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Paddy. Yeah, I think the question from Ngozi is quite relevant and very specific to the Gambian context. Of course, I don't want to speak for the government. I don't want to speak for the politicians on their behalf. I'm a humanitarian, and then, I want to speak from purely a humanitarian perspective. So with the Red Cross, of course, we know this is already happening. And then, we have no hand in it, but what we can do is, like I stated earlier, the role of the Red Cross is neutral. Neutral in the sense that we respond based on needs of migrants, regardless of who you are, regardless of your status. Whether you are a return migrant, you're a migrant in transit, a refugee, an asylum seeker, an internally displaced person, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is if there exists a vulnerability, and then this vulnerability has been identified by us, then of course we will definitely come in and then support. So in terms of promoting, let's say, fighting discrimination, xenophobia, and so on. So this is something that the Red Cross is doing, and then it directly relates to GCM objective 16 and 17. So in this, where we social cohesion and inclusion, where the Red Cross, in essence, conduct outreach exercises, communication activities, information sharing activities to shape perception and change narratives on migration. because of course, if you return back in some instances, you are regarded as a failure, and then within your society, I mean, those are things that would eventually come out clearly, and then this results to some sort of mental trauma or psychological trauma for the individual who had embarked on the journey. So the Red Cross, in a sense, would conduct kind of community dialogues to promote social cohesion, but also to sort of promote non-discrimination and then xenophobic rhetorics in the community. So I think this is one important thing that the Red Cross also do. Another thing that we also do is then we continue to promote peace building initiatives to sustain peace, social cohesion in communities, specifically related to climate migration and displacement due to maybe conflicts and so on. So in essence, we definitely doing something around this to ensure that people are able to welcome back into society. They're able to live together with the returned migrants in a more harmonious way. So yeah, so going back to your question, Paddy, I think of course the international humanitarian law has provided the ground for the Red Cross, because the ICRC is the custodian of the IHL. So it has that mandate to remind states of their obligation, but also Red Cross movement, conducts advocacies around this law just to ensure that states are able to, take up their obligation to protect their citizens and all peoples found within their borders. So of course, within the context of, this issue of migration and also conflict, the Red Cross has a role to play in ensuring that states, respect the law, but also parties to conflicts or as well respect the law, international humanitarian law to be specific, just to ensure that the lives and properties of civilians are protected, but also even armed combatants who have surrendered are also protected under international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Apologies for that. Thank you for that. Professor Binod, would you like to come in and share some reflections? And Dr. Raj, I also see you're here.
Yes, thank you, Paddy. I know that time is running out, but and we started 1 hour late. But this has been very inspiring and educative last session, concluding session of the webinar. And this is, if I'm not wrong, I think this is the last one. Before we go into the long-awaited examination, the test that our participants are eagerly waiting to enjoy, and I'm using the word enjoy. I think this has been very complimentary presentations by the 3 speakers, and starting with Irudaya Rajan, who shared the problems of data collection and data dissemination. And this has been extremely variegated and heterogeneous across the world. On the one hand, you have countries like United States or Australia, where latest data, up-to-date data are available, whether they are freely available or they are sold in the market or controlled in one way or the other. I think data management is a big issue. There is a political economy of data and management, and we should not undermine that. We should not be living in a fool's paradise that data are there and they are there to be available to all the researchers. No, data are sometimes they hide the data. There are vested interests. Sometimes the data are not collected. Sometimes the data are wrongly collected. Sometimes the data are collected in a wrong methodology, and so on. And there are fictitious data. So one has to, of course, handle that in a long-term manner. And my colleague Irudaya Rajan has rightly pointed out the issues. And if they wrong, data are quoted even in Parliament, then this is a very serious matter. And we need to take that into account. Even I would say post 9/11, the US data on migration large sections of the data of the DHS at that time, it was Immigration and Naturalization Service, had gone underground. They were taken out from the public domain. So these are challenges that we, the researchers, we have to differentiate ourselves in our role as researchers and activists, and we have to play both the roles, but not mix them up. That is very, very important. So from data, information, and then to policy and action, that is very important. Then we had Babako, who talked about the Red Cross, role of the Red Cross, which is extremely important. And there are many other agencies which are particularly, I think, more geared towards handling the issues of refugees than migrants. That I think we need to understand properly. What are the two boxes that we are dealing with? Because today's session is about GCM and GCR. And this is where I think Chiara's last point about that the Refugee Convention is 70 years old, and has it lost its relevance? We have to ask that question. Has it lost its relevance, or has it lost its edges and has become blunt and not addressing what we need to understand today? That I think is important. And at the same time, are we barking up the wrong tree? Are we talking about issues which are related to economic migrants and we are taking them into the other box of the refugees, or the vice versa? Or are we actually, we should not have two boxes. It is actually one box. When we say refugees, we tend to have a picture of people, who are dilapidated, who are without clothes, without, food and things like that. No, that's not true. Their status is that of refugees, but they're highly skilled. They are equally qualified. They are professionals. Their status, they are persona non grata. And that I think we need to understand. We have to demystify that. That I think is extremely important. If the two compacts need to learn from each other, if the two compacts need to be addressed in a holistic manner, then we have to address the issues that Chiara has mentioned towards the end of her intervention. And I'm glad that this is the session with which we are concluding our certificate course today. So I think there is a lot that we need to learn, a lot that we need to discuss, and a lot that we need to demystify. Thank you, Paddy, for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Binod, for sharing those reflections. Dr. Raj, do you want to come in?
Okay, thank you very much, Paddy, and to the panelists. Fascinating presentations and great discussion. I agree with Professor Kadria that actually the two should be taken at the same time, because the distinction is blurred. Sometimes it could be very blurred, whether they're economic refugees or they are really, really refugees in the sense that they cannot stay in their country because they're forced. Are they forced people? Whether you're forced through economic circumstances or forced through political or other, they're forced. So I think it's good to look at this. And then what I want to talk about is the perceptions of people on the move, perceptions about the people on the move into where they intend to go. And I think perceptions are very, very critical because this is how they're treated. So if the perceptions are that they're there either to stay permanently and therefore they become a threat, sometimes a security threat, because we take the case up, and I think there will be a lot of examples given from Ukraine now. Ukraine, it's a very sad situation, but the integration of those who are on the move or those who are seeking asylum is very different. They have been integrated. I was reading somewhere that teachers who were teaching in Ukraine and who have gone to Poland, who have fled to Poland, they have been brought back into the teaching profession so they can teach the children, Ukrainian children, in their language, and at the same time have language classes for them to learn Polish or wherever they are in the EU. Now, this is very swift. Very swiftly, they have been integrated in a matter of 2 weeks. okay, or 3 weeks, or less than 2 weeks actually. So perceptions are varied, but otherwise people who are moving from the global south to wherever, they say, well, they are here to stay permanently, because refugee is supposed to be seeking protection for a fixed period of time. And even in the case of Ukraine, I think initially the EU has given 3 years, and hopefully within that, you know, they will go back. When the US took people from Kosovo, there was no permanent settlement. It was for, as soon as your country is back on its feet, you will go back, and some were repatriated and others, but somehow. So what I'm saying is that we need to talk about the perceptions. How are people from the global south seen? They are valuable people, they have skills, they contribute and to the host country, but the perceptions are very different, and therefore it will impact the way they are integrated. And that integration will impact the way they will contribute to both origin and to destination countries. And I like Tiara's context. She's saying, but we need to actually look at both together and look for where are the complementarities, and rather than saying this is a separate one and this is another one. So I think we should be talking about the complementarities and reviewing actually some of those conventions, not only the refugee convention, but other conventions which have impact on migrants, labor rights, and so on. I think we should be looking at that and saying how outmoded or up to date they are in the reality of the situation, changing situations, and what does that mean? What are the ways forward? So I think this discussion has been very good. So thank you very much.
Dr. Raj, thank you very much on sharing those reflections, and many thanks to also Professor Binod on touching on some very critical issues. Thanks to our panelists. I think, you know, in wrap up, it's always difficult to wrap up. Firstly, because we are wrapping up the GCM webinar series in essential as it is, even though we will be continuing. I think as some students have noted that we had space for some discussions on the reviews, and we have decided to tie that up with the People's Migration Challenge, with other conversations that are taking place, which we will not push students to move further to, but I think are still very important to engage on. But particularly on this topic, where we looked at the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact for migration, you know, data, as Professor Rajan has pointed out, remains critical and is something that is highlighted in both compacts. We also have heard of the need for complementarity. We've also talked about, you know, conceptualization and maybe just, you know, calling a spade instead of trying to put people into boxes, and also accepting the data, which means accepting the migrants, essentially accepting the people that are in front of us instead of putting tags on them. It's really been interesting to see the references to Ukraine, to the Ukraine crisis, and the differences, I think, that have come out in treatment of similar people. I would say similar people fleeing out of the same universities, the same towns that are being bombed, the same communities that they lived in, but receiving very different treatment in other spaces. We've heard of countries lifting restrictions that we thought would have been impossible. Some visa options are popping here and there, both within the EU and other Western countries. You've also seen just the difference in how, for instance, the Ukrainians have this affiliation to go back, and the EU, for instance, listening quite closely to these ambitions of wanting to go back. And how often have we heard these kind of conversations happen for labor migrants, for migrants that have moved because they have been pushed by environmental factors or drivers, that they have expressed certain needs, and those needs have not been listened to. But it tells us, I think, in daily examples, that the intention and the political will needs to be fed with advocacy. It's a noise that we need to make to keep sounding, because it's actually not a noise, but it's voices. They're very important voices, and eventually somebody will open the door. The need for partnership has been emphasized here, whether we're talking about data, whether we're also talking about different actors on the ground, humanitarian work, provision of services, and also just looking at the range of partners that would be involved even in the advocacy space or in the research space. We've talked about the relevance and us also kind of looking at the edges, are these compacts serving the purpose of which they were designed for? And that talks a lot about participation. The Global South and the Global North divides are very clear. Chiara was good enough to also point to us how even countries that have not implemented or signed up to the GCM still pick up some pieces. So maybe that also talks to us about the need for local and urgent action, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about visa regimes. COVID also showed us that the world and countries and these very sort of rigid looking systems, laws that could not be changed over centuries, were able to change during COVID and have been able to change suit in certain crises. So once again, and then just, wrapping it up, talking about some of the principles that indeed are cross-cutting, in both spaces as well. Protection remains important, whether we are defining people as migrants, refugees, IDPs, internal, external. And even, people in the diaspora space would say, could you please also add diaspora there? And many other categories would indeed open up. Integration remains important, as is durable solutions, which is the language that the GCR predominantly uses. The child sensitivity and the gender sensitiveness in terms of all these kind of policies remain important, and a whole lot of other issues that we have unpacked today. So thank you again to our panelists, Professor Rajan, Bubakar, Chiara, for sharing from your spaces. And also just being able to reflect back into some of the comments that were shared from our audience. To our very active audience since day one in September, we want to say thank you for your engagement. We hope that you keep on with this spirit of engaging in different forums. We'll continue to keep you posted on other events. And maybe just in closing that session for our students, we have circulated the sample questions for the test, and we're calling it a test and not an examination because we've got a lot of feedback coming to us and saying, are we going to pass and are we going to fail? We can have a true test that everybody has learned a lot. We have Bubakar today on our platform. That just shows us the bodies of knowledge that we have within our classrooms. We have sent the questions. There are only 63 of them. We will be testing, so it's a group test. Everybody will answer individually, but the idea is for us to interact as well on that particular day on Saturday. So please, at 3 o'clock Central European time, but we will send all the correct information on the time in the classroom. Please have a look at the questions and join the test. As of next week, we will continue to share with you the People's Migration Challenge information, because this remains important to continue the conversations of the GCM and its interaction with many other spaces under the auspice of the People's Migration Challenge, where we're really going on that people's road to the IMRF. So there are a number of events that have been lined up. You can sign up to the People's Migration Challenge. I will put up the link. And also you are receiving periodically all the messages that are coming through, so you can follow the deliberations and you can engage. Please do engage in these discussions, because various voices are needed for this. With that, thank you so much. And yes, we will have a graduation. I know I see private messages popping. When are we graduating? Yes, we will graduate to make an official close, and we will be talking all about that on Saturday. But for today, thank you very much for being here. And thank you very much for the long ride since September. To our panelists for today, thank you for being part of this very special session.